Hello. Hi. Oops, I just knocked my water over. I'm Heather Morris, and I've got to stop waving my hands around when I speak. Thank you so much for joining me today. Look, I'm here to talk to you about, my latest novel, which came out last month. And I'm now able to talk about not only with you, but in person. Because guess where I'm speaking to you from? Gladstone, Queensland. I came up here yesterday. I'm actually on a book tour. I am traveling. I'm talking to people live and in front of them, and it's wonderful. But for now, I need to start talking to you about Three Sisters, not about my time in Gladstone. Rocky tonight, by the way. Before I can talk to you about Three Sisters, I need to talk to you about how I got the story. Because I'm this lucky author who, for every story I've written, there's a story behind the story. This one is no exception. And I'm delighted that with the cover of the book that you can see next to it is the cover of my first novel, The Tattooist of Auschwitz. That is significant, folks. That cover is the reason I can now talk to you, and I have written Three Sisters. So let's quickly back up on where I got the story. Then I'll tell you about the story. I was in South Africa, and I think it was June 2019. I was in this lovely little wine region there called Franschhoek. I wasn't just there to drink the wine. I was actually at a book festival, but I did drink the wine. One night I came back to my room about 1 or 2 in the morning, and I opened an email. It was from a man called Odette Ravik. He lives in Canada, in Toronto, and he wrote telling me that he had picked up a copy of The Tattooist of Auschwitz and had taken it to his mother, who lives in Tel Aviv in Israel. Now, this is why that cover is significant. Of the 55 countries that have published The Tattooist of Auschwitz, only 2 other countries took the Australian cover, Canada and Brazil. And if that wasn't the case, then when Lully left that book on his mother's coffee table, she would not have been able to look down and recognize those numbers on the arms, because that's what she did. She saw the cover and she said to her son, "That must be about Lully and Gita." And when he asked her how could she know that, she said, "Simple, look at the number on the arm of the girl. Now look at the number on my arm. It's 3 away. Your Auntie Sibby's was 2 away from Gita's. We went to school with Gita. We were on the train going to Auschwitz with Gita. We were in Block 21 in Birkenau with Gita. And don't you remember her? She used to come to Israel and she would stay with your Aunt Magda. You met her when you were a boy." You read that email no matter what the hour of the night is, and no matter how many glasses of beautiful wine you've had, you do not sleep. Within the next 48 hours, several emails were exchanged between us. And then I got a message from him saying that his mother, Livia, wanted to speak with me. I rang her from Cape Town, talking to her for a few minutes, and she said, "I need to see you. There's so much I can tell you, and I want to talk to you, but I don't like talking on the telephone." By the way, if you're wondering about my backdrop here, it's because I'm in a hotel room, okay? This is not my normal look. Of course, her saying to me, would I come and talk to her, the implication was that I would just immediately go. Well, guess what, folks? I did. Within 48 hours, I flew from Johannesburg straight to Tel Aviv, into the apartment, into the arms of Livy and her family, and Magda and her family, and Sibby's family. These are the names. Once you've heard them, I don't think you'll forget when you know their story. Livy, Magda, and Sibby. Now, Sibby died in 2014, so I never got to meet her. She was the eldest. I tell you that Livy turned 96 last week. And on the 1st of January, Magda will turn 98. They still live in their own apartments by themselves in Tel Aviv. These 2 incredible, extraordinary women. The first few days I was there in Israel with them, meeting the family, and Livy wanted to tell me about Lully and Gita, but their children and their grandchildren wanted to tell me about the girls, the sisters. And I started hearing more and more of their story. I suggested they find a ghostwriter in Israel and have it recorded. Sibi and Livy, the oldest and the youngest, they had made Shoah videotapes, which I've subsequently seen and got translated because I actually couldn't understand it. It's all in Hebrew, but translated, I've watched them as well. I was sent to Jerusalem for a day. Go there, they told me. And in my absence, the family gathered. And when I got back, they said to me, please, would you write our story the same way that you have written Lali's? Not as a memoir, not as a biography, but in that same fictionalized sense, using their words, their conversation, their dialogue, and reimagining what they are going to now tell me. During that period, over many months of course, Zoom and WhatsApp video chats, particularly with Livy, I started to get this story. And then I was lucky enough to be able to go back into Israel in January last year, just before the world went kaput, and spend more time with these amazing families. When a first draft, or probably about a fifth draft, but we'll call it the first, when that was ready, it got sent to the families in Israel. The book Three Sisters would never have gone anywhere near printers unless every adult member of that family, 3 generations, agreed to its content and how I had written it. I got the comments back. Some of them couldn't resist telling me where I missed the comma or I'd spelt something wrong. It wasn't what they were to do, but we have other editors for that, but I loved it anyway. And there was only one thing they told me I had wrong and asked me to change it. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit because it ties into my telling these stories and some of the dangers and some of the challenges of writing a true story that writers face. Well, this writer does anyway. I suspect others do too. Let's start with the book now. It starts with a promise made by 3 little girls, not the teenagers, 3, 5, and 7 years of age. And I'm going to give this first spoiler away here, but I don't mind. Because if you picked up this book and skimmed the first couple of pages in a bookshop or in a library, you'd read it anyway. The girls make a promise at that very young age to their father that they will stay together. They will not let anything separate them. He was asking them to be there for each other for the rest of their days, that they were stronger as 3 than they would ever be apart. And here's the spoiler. They could not know that the next day their father would die. He had an inkling. Well, he knew it was on the cards, which is why he made them make the promise. So in revealing that spoiler to you, I'm now going to just talk about why my books are called fiction and how do I write them and call them fiction when I'm telling you a true story. So I'm going to use that as an example of my writing. I kind of call it, and yeah, maybe this is just me trying to justify my style, a reimagining of what the girls, and that's what I'll call the girls, Livy, Magda, and Sibi, the girls, what they tell me, what the Shoah tapes tell me. They were made some 25 years ago. And how I then write that to be able to present it to you, the readers. When I ask Livy and Magda about what do they remember of that last day with their father, well, Livy tries to say she remembers it, and Magda kind of looks at her and rolls her eyes and goes, you were 3, of course you don't remember. What you remember is Sibi and I telling you for the rest of your life and reminding each other for the rest of our life about that. So in being able to tell that scene or write that scene, I asked them, tell me about your house. Could you remember anything about that? No, they couldn't. So I asked them to describe their home in Vronov in Slovakia. And they described a very modest home of 1 bedroom they shared with their mother. And then Livy giggled because their grandfather slept in what she called a broom closet and a little kitchen area with just a table and chairs. And then Magda said, but I remember the back garden more than I do inside the house. She said, Livy, remember, there was an oleander tree in the backyard and it kept wanting to die and Mama wouldn't let it. Every winter it tried to die and every spring Mama brought it back to life. And then Livy chimed in with, And the gate on the back fence that never got fixed. And when the wind blew, it bang, and it used to frighten me when I was a little girl in bed at night. I have been presented with the two places those girls were living in at the time, inside and outside. I now reimagine that scene with their father, their papa, and I can put it inside or out. No brainer. I put it outside beside the oleander tree with the gate banging in the background. That is my fictionalizing the true event that happened. Now I'm going to move on. That's just me trying to explain and justify being a fiction writer of true stories. But these girls would then get separated in April 1942. And separated, I mean, because two of them, the youngest and the eldest, got taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau on that train with Gita. Magda, she was in hospital. She was unwell, and a well-meaning Christian doctor who came to see her persuaded her mother to have her put in hospital, even though she didn't really need to be, thinking that he might just be able to save her. You know, Magda, I think, still struggles to this day at the age of nearly 98 with her mother and her grandfather being responsible for her being separated from her two sisters for 2.5 years. So the story of their time during the Holocaust is told in a dual narrative of Livy and Sibyl in Auschwitz-Birkenau, Magda back in Slovakia with her mother and grandfather for those 2.5 years. Until, of course, she was caught, taken to Birkenau. She didn't know her sisters were there. She didn't know where she was. And that those girls found each other and reunited in that most evil place on earth, where over 100,000 people would be crammed in at any point in time. Everybody restricted to their area, their block, their very small compound of the women's block. And yet they found each other. That was October 1944. On January the 18th, 1945, they left along with all the other girls and women in those camps on a death march. A march that would see thousands not survive, middle of winter in Poland and Germany. I sometimes think that maybe I should have done what I did with Lali's story and ended it at that Auschwitz moment, because their survival of the death march really is worthy of the book itself. It is phenomenal. Hey guys, that death march didn't go for days or weeks, months. As these girls and boys, men and women, young men and women, were moved from concentration camp to concentration camp. Sometimes they'd be put into a train, into an open coal carriage to survive the elements, but most of the time they just walked, going further and further into Germany, further and further, it was hoped, away from the Russians who were advancing on them. These girls remember that death march vividly. And I've been able to record many of the events, not all of them, there's too many, that happened on that death march with them. What I don't have in the book, and which I do now have, are specific dates and town and village names during the time from the 30th of April, when the sisters and several other young girls decided enough was enough was enough. And they confronted the SS officer who was nearest to them on the death march and told him they were leaving, challenged him. Shoot us if you will, we're leaving. And they did, they ran. And for the next, I think, well, close to 2 months, they then hid in the villages and towns in Germany. Well, not really the towns, they wouldn't go into them, they would circle around them, sleeping in barns, sleeping outside. I guess the only good thing in some ways was that spring and summer came. But describing to me the different places they sheltered, where they found food, how they dug up the roots of trees and bushes in the forest to survive. Livy falling asleep one day, exhausted by a lake, waking up, surrounded and covered in butterflies. To her, she cannot see a butterfly today, and not be transported back to that lake and that area of Germany. She doesn't know exactly where she was. They describe finding what they called a castle. It was a huge chalet, been described as multiple bedrooms, 3 floors of really sumptuous a lifestyle, but it was abandoned. And here's one of the great things about these girls. They've been deprived for 3 years of anything resembling normality. And they come across this abandoned palace or castle. And they go in and they find some preserved food, and there's a bit of food there. And I'm telling you bits of the story, but I don't mind. They found food that had obviously gone off because it had been left out. That's how they knew it was abandoned. Downstairs, they found a massive dining room with a huge table and chairs in it. A local farmer came past because he saw people in the house and wanted to know who they were. He was going to shoo them away. And when he found out who they were, he took some of them back to his farm and gave them milk and cheese and preserved meats. And for their first night, for freedom, well, actually, it wasn't their first. They'd been in different barns and areas before that. But they looked at this table in this dining room and they said, we can't sit at this. It's not ours. And so they then talked about, do you think the owners would mind if they still wanted to just sit at a table and on a chair? They then took that table outside, and for the first time in over 3 years, sat at a table and chair with meager food under the stars. When it was time to try and rest, they went upstairs and found a bedroom for every one of them. They couldn't lie down on those beds, but they thought the owners wouldn't mind if they borrowed the blankets, and they took them downstairs and they slept on the floor in the dining room, now minus its table. So that death march, by the way, more can be now not only written about it, but the detail of the exact day, the exact month, exactly where they were, the names of the villages. We now have that information. It was just prior to the book going to the printers. The family found a diary that Magda had kept, written in real time, some 77 years ago on that death march. In one of those concentration camps, she went inside to the administration building for something, and she stole a journal, a notebook, and some pens. And we now have some 80 pages of her beautiful handwriting, all in Slovakian, the date, in some places even the time of the day she's writing, the name of the village they believe they're in, whether it's the Germans or the Russians that are currently threatening them and surrounding them. That document has now been found, and historically it will rank up there as being incredibly significant to be able to read something written in real time. The original, of course, will go to Yad Vashem, and what we do with it and what the family choose to do with that in terms of making it freely available, we're going to work through that. But in the back of the book, we managed to persuade the printers. I know the book's typeset. I know it's ready to roll. The printers are warming up. Can we please put another page in? On the very back of the book, there is one extract. I got chose, pick one extract out of that diary that you want to put in. You'll see it written in Magda's handwriting in Slovakian, and you'll see the translation next to it in English. I chose an entry that Magda wrote at midnight on the 8th of May, 1945. It was the day they were told by Russian soldiers that the war was over. You get to read Magda's thoughts and Magda's feelings, and I wish I still didn't get goosebumps just talking about this, but I do. What was she then? 19, 20-year-old girl wrote, hearing the war is over. They're not liberated still. They're still in danger because there's still fighting going on around them. Incredible. And maybe that's something else I can say to you, by the way, too. Before you read the book, go to the back, start at the back. Not with the words. No, don't do that. But look at the photos, the many photos that are there of the girls as youngsters, as teenagers, as brides, as mothers, as old women. Have a look at them and see these incredible women, girls. And then you'll have this picture in your head when you're reading about them, what they look like. So start at the back, but then text at the front, please. That they then survived and were able to get back to Slovakia after they found one of the displaced persons camps in Germany. And along with the other youngsters, young men and women from Czechoslovakia, they were finally sent back to their home country. That's what they do. They gathered all these displaced people up and sorted them out into their country of origin and then eventually transported them back. This is why I'm now going to tell you what I mentioned earlier about the challenges of writing a true story. When I'm writing these stories, by the way, writing the words and seeing the words on the screen when I'm writing them, I disassociate from it. I do not emotionally connect with these horrific things I'm writing about at that time. I know how to self-care. I know how to protect myself from this. Oh, by the way, don't ever ask me to read my books. Now, that's a totally different story. I told you that there was one thing that the family, Livy and Magda, said I got wrong in that original manuscript. And it was their return to Czechoslovakia. And I'm going to tell you what I did and what they made me correct. I heard from the girls what it was like in person from Livy and Magda. I heard Sibby's account from it by reading the translation of her Shoah tape, also Livy's translation of her Shoah tape. So I had a total understanding of how that played out. And of course, well, I didn't know at the time, Magda also has written about it in her diary. What happened? 5 buses left that camp in Germany. And as they approached Prague and approached the Charles Bridge, which you go over to then go into the city of Prague and into the Wenceslas Square, I really can't say that word properly, but never mind. Those of you who have been there, you know what I'm talking about. Thousands of people lined the streets as those buses tried to make their way through to the square, throwing flowers onto the buses, weeping, applauding, forcing the buses to stop so that they could press money and food into the hands of these returning youngsters. And I started writing that, and I suddenly got angry. I let my own emotions come into my telling that vignette, those scenes. For me, it was, how dare they? How dare these people think that they can force a silver dollar into Magda's hands and all is forgiven when they were responsible for sending them away in the first place? These people are responsible for these youngsters coming home to nothing and no one. Their family's gone. And I wrote those scenes in that very angry mode. And making it out to be something that the people who did that needed to be called out for. Well, Livy and Magda wrote back to me and said, "You got that wrong. You got that so wrong." That was the happiest day of our life. We came home. We came home. So I did a rewrite. You get to read my rewrite. I can see where they're coming from, because at that point in time, yeah, they came home. That home didn't work out for them. That's another story. And it's in the book, that other story. How they tried to settle in Bratislava, rejected from their hometown of Ronov, still being not given jobs, not being given appropriate housing. The only good thing that happened in Bratislava for them, Sibby fell in love. She married and had a baby. But Livy and Magda then determined they now were going to leave. Sibby promised she would follow them with her husband and baby when she could. They trained with a group of other young boys and girls in the forest to be survivors, to travel to the promised land. And in February 1949, Livy and Magda stepped off a boat in Haifa in Israel. At that pivotal point in history, that nation state was being created. I now get to tell you, the reader, what it was like at that time in history for the newest country being born through the eyes of young boys and girls and their involvement in that. The academics and the historians, that they've written about it for decades, and it's well and truly documented. Read about it now from these youngsters. Livy had a relationship with a man, Chaim Weizmann. When I say relationship, that sounds romantic. He was like, no, I back up. Her friendship with the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, is a story to behold. How this man and his wife, the first lady of Israel, welcomed her as their maid, but just not as their maid, but how they embraced her. And Weizmann would sit with her in the garden every chance he got and remind her the soil they stand on here belongs more to her than it does to him being the president. She has suffered so much to be here. She was there working for him when he died. Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, would come to visit the president weekly for his sessions, seek out Livy, take her arm and kiss her numbers. Every leader around the world who came to visit the first president of Israel was introduced to Livy and told she is the reason we're building this country. Helen Keller came to visit. When introduced to Livy, tapped out a message on her hand. Henry Ford, he brought the limousine to give as a gift to the first president. Livy was chauffeured home in that whenever she worked late at night by the president's chauffeur to the house that she lived in with her husband, which wasn't a house, it was a goat house. When Ziggy lay down to sleep at night, his feet hung out the door. In the back, I mentioned there's photos of the girls there as brides. Check out the one with Livy and Ziggy and the woman standing next to her. It is Vera Weizmann, the first lady of Israel. Now, I'm running out of time. There are so many storylines I can tell you in here about my researching in Slovakia to find out that Livy's name really isn't Livy, it's Esther. Finding out she's a year older than she thought she was. So much has happened to me in telling the story and finding out the story, and also to the families of the girls. Sibby's two boys, Kari and Yossi. Sibby's two girls, Haya and Ditty. Livy's son and daughter, Odie and Dorrit. I am so grateful for them and their part in the story. I will be back in Israel in January. I need to give these girls and these families a big hug. I'm in their lives now for as long as they want me and for as long as I'm alive. Livy asked if she could adopt me a while back. I turned her down. I said, no, you've got your two. You'll bugger up the sequence of 2 kids per girl if you did that. But I thank you so much for the time you've taken to watch me today, hear a little bit about 3 sisters. They are extraordinary women. They were extraordinary girls. Their survival, Magda's in Slovakia for 2.5 years, denied her sisters. But all she wanted to be, she didn't care where they were. She wanted to be with them. And you can imagine how she now has had to live with, guilt's the only word to describe it. And she would describe it that way. That for 2.5 years, she slept in her own bed. When she got to Birkenau, she saw how her sisters had been living for those 2.5 years. Of course, Sibby and Livy are just grateful that she wasn't there. So it's a dual thing again. The 2 girls happy that one wasn't suffering like they were. The other one almost wishing that she was, because she would at least have been with them. My time is up. I thank you again. Thank you so much for this event, Better Readings. It's been my pleasure. 3 Sisters, it's out there now. There's a wonderful audio book of it, written by an amazing woman called Finty Williams. You may not recognize her name. I think the majority of you might know who her mum is. And thanks to her mum, Finty, considered UK audiobook royalty, the daughter of Dame Judi Dench, has done a wonderful job in reading this story for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Or as they say in Slovakia, Ďakujem. Ďakujem.